L'explosion a eu lieu aux alentours de 18h45 à la synagogue israélienne.
On Friday, October 3rd, 1980, 320 members of the Rue Copernic synagogue in Paris had gathered to mark the start of Shabbat. What began as a regular Friday evening, a time to slow down, mark the end of the week, and be with friends and family, ended tragically. 4 people were killed and 46 injured after a bomb exploded outside the shul. Within days of the attack, thousands of citizens flooded the streets of Paris, protesting the bombing. Eventually, French investigators named a man named Hassan Diab as its main suspect. Diab, a Lebanese-Canadian professor, was eventually charged and extradited from Canada to France, 28 years after the attack. How Diab got caught up in the investigation and how he was even extradited, despite the fact that a Canadian judge said the case against him was weak, forms the basis for the podcast The Copernic Affair, hosted by journalists Atack and Dana Ballout. I'm Kathleen Goldhar, and this is Crime Story. Alex and Dana, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
So, Alex, let's start with October 3rd, 1980. Can you take me back to that evening and what happened?
Yeah, so on the evening of October 3rd, 1980, it was a Friday night and there was a congregation gathering at the Rue Copernic synagogue, which is one of the oldest Reform synagogues in France. Around 6:30, which is sort of when the congregation were due to come out, a bomb was detonated on the street outside. It was time to go off at the time where I guess the attackers presumed that people would be leaving the synagogue, and the congregation was running over, the services were running over that evening. So most people were still inside. I mean, in fact, all of the congregation was still inside. And as you said, there were sort of 300 plus people there that night. So the bomb went off when everybody was still inside, and the people who were killed and most of the people injured were passers-by. 4 people were killed in the attack. All of them just happened to be walking past the synagogue at the time of the attack.
Your podcast does start with talking about the people who died, or at least a few of them. Can you tell us who they were?
So Eliza Chagrier we interviewed one of her sons for the podcast. Eliza was visiting from Israel. She was a journalist herself and a film editor, I think.
Yeah.
And she was visiting a friend in Paris. And, it was around dinner time. So she wanted to stop by a supermarket and buy some figs for her dinner, like to bring as you would when you're going over someone's house for dinner. Eliza was young. She was in her 40s.
She was 42 when she was killed. She was beautiful, joyful, very opinionated. In some ways, she was the center of the family. Especially, I think, her warmth and empathy, because as a child, she was the more dominant parent in the house, taking care of us.
One of her sons was with her that day. Luckily, her son had already been at the house where the dinner was taking place. She passed away. Philippe Bissou was on a motorcycle going to visit his fiancée. He was in his 20s. Jean Barbe was a driver waiting in his car outside of the Copernic synagogue. And Hilario Fernandez was a hotel concierge, also just happened to be walking by the Copernic synagogue that day.
Those clearly weren't the intended victims, but what do you know, or did anybody take responsibility? What was the sense of why this bomb went off?
So at the time, immediately in the aftermath of the attack, the AFP received a call from a far-right neo-Nazi group in France called FAN. They had initially claimed responsibility, but as we know with many attacks even today, those who claim responsibility are sometimes not the perpetrators. And what was found that in fact, they were not the perpetrators of the attack, and police quickly directed their investigation to groups in the Middle East and eventually landed, although they never claimed it and have yet to say whether or not they did it, but the police ended up landing on this group called the PFLPOS, which stands for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and in particular, their External Operations Group. OS stands for just External Operations in French. The PFLPOS have never claimed responsibility for this, but that's who police believe perpetrated the attack.
Alex, how did they go from looking at that organization and then sort of drawing a line to Hassan Diab?
Yeah, that's a really long story. So the French police, in the days after the attack, the bomb was strapped to a motorbike. They took the serial number from the bike, which they then traced to the motorbike shop. And when they were there, they met a few people who'd crossed paths with the attacker in the days before the attack. From them, they were able to sort of get a police sketch drawn up. So they had a sort of rough idea what this person might have looked like. They also got the name of the hotel where the guy was staying. So when they visited there were a few other people who said they maybe remembered him as well. They got their hands on the hotel card that he'd filled in when he checked in, which had 5 words of, it said the words Alexander Panadriou, which was the fake name he was using, Larnaca, Cyprus, technician. So just 5 words, but a limited handwriting sample that they believed to be the handwriting of the attacker. None of it pointed really towards, it pointed towards a fake name, which was Alexander Panadriou, but that led them nowhere because, he'd escaped the country by the time they'd sort of managed to trace the passport, and it was a fake name anyways. And so the name Hassan Diab didn't come up until years later, actually. After that initial investigation by French police, the case kind of slipped onto the back burner for many years. It didn't seem like there was any way of pushing it forward. Despite the kind of immense pressure that the French police would have been under, there was just like nothing more that they could really do. And then a new investigating judge took over, and he was the one who kind of went back through the trove of evidence that had already been gathered and dug deeper into what was there. And he found that Italian police had seized the passport from a guy who was connected to the PFLPOS, which is the group who the French believed carried out the attack. A member of this group was caught passing through Rome airport in 1981. And when they took him aside, they found that on his person, he had a bunch of passports. And one of these passports belonged to a man called Hassan Diab. And that's how Hassan Diab first enters the story.
This investigative judge is something that I think most North Americans would find surprising. He had a personality and he had a point of view. Can you tell me a little bit about who he is and like what his job was?
Yeah. So investigative judges in France are very different than what we, view as judges, or our image of judges in the US or Canada. Investigative judges in France get appointed to this position. Mark Trevedick was a young, ambitious investigative judge that was specialized in anti-terrorism in France. And at the time, it was 2007, he had 80 cases landing on his desk when he took over the position, and he decided that the Copernic case was one of the cases to focus on because people had died in the case, and because he had this name, Hassan Diab, who he believed was living freely in Ottawa, so he saw an opportunity. An investigative judge in France personally investigates. So Mark Trevedick traveled to the US. He spoke to people in the FBI. He has a bunch of contacts in Lebanon. And I just want to note that Mark Trevedick has always had this kind of, fascination or leaning towards the Middle East. So this was like right up his alley.
Yeah, he tells you, first of all, you speak to him, which is amazing. I don't know the last time I heard a judge talking to journalists, but also he speaks Arabic, right?
Yes, he said that he spoke Arabic. I didn't test him on his Arabic, but yes. Yes, he said he was, initially fascinated by, as many people get introduced to the Middle East, is through Lawrence of Arabia. And then he actually wrote a fiction novel based in, I think, somewhere in Northern Africa, Tunisia or Algeria or something. It was like a romance novel. And he has this he definitely has this thing.
He was like a character out of Lawrence of Arabia.
Exactly. Modern day. Modern day, yeah.
Also a aspiring rock star as well. I mean, he goes, on French television. He's been known to jump up with the house band, sing a cover of Velvet Underground.
Yeah,
he's a character.
Yeah.
I mean, he loves the spotlight, and he was actually good at it. And even when we, we had what we call a tape syncer, so someone to go meet him, because obviously I was in LA, Alex is in the UK, and he's in Paris. So when we had someone to go record his audio for the interview, the person was quite excited that they were going to meet the famous Mark Trevidick. He's quite a figure in France. And also, during, the ISIS days, and there were all these bombings in Paris, he really even rose to even more prominence. So Mark Trevidick is a character. He definitely is. And he personally investigated for a year. Between 2007 and 2008, he himself was investigating. And that's the difference really between judges in France and then the US and UK. They personally investigate, and then they decide whether the case should be taken to trial or not.
So, Alex, within his investigation, what was it that he told you guys that really made him believe that Hassan was the person they needed to pin this on?
Yeah, he had this passport, which I think for him was sort of one of the most compelling pieces of evidence. I just say here that Hassan's version of, he says that that was his passport. It did end up in the hands of this guy who was part of this group, but that he had lost his passport. It had fallen off the back of his motorbike while he was traveling to university. And this is during the civil war in Beirut. And we spoke to a bunch of historians about this, and it was common for these groups to use fake passports, stolen passports, and there was a black market for these kinds of passports in Beirut at the time. So, it's not outside the realms of possibility that this group might have picked up Hassan Diab's passport and used it to commit an attack. But just to say, that's Hassan's version of events.
You don't report anything in the civil war. They would laugh at you. If you go to the police station to report something, the police would laugh at you if you come to say, they say, you see, the people are getting killed in the streets, and you want me to look for your passport? It would look like super ridiculous.
So Trevidick had the passport. He also had, this is a bit complicated because this wasn't submitted as evidence, but there are intelligence reports which come from the German Stasi archive, and there were some intelligence reports from the Israeli intelligence service, which apparently included Hassan Diab's name as somebody who was involved in this group and involved in the attack. We managed to see that intelligence report. I mean, the first thing you'll notice is it gets the date of the attack wrong. And so it's hard to say how reliable these reports are. The Israeli one that we saw contained multiple errors and basic errors at that.
What can you tell me the reports did say about Hassan's sort of activity, especially as a student, right? That was the issue. He was growing up in Lebanon and there was a war going on. And tell me sort of what they said he got involved in that made them think this guy might have these extreme ideas. Yeah,
so the intelligence reports and the story Mark Trevidick believed about Hassan Diab was that he was a young student who was involved in political groups in Beirut at the time, and who got so involved in some of these groups that it led him down a kind of dark path to engaging in violence with these groups as well.
The intelligence reports did claim that he had ties to militia groups as a student. Did he have any of those ties?
Hassan denies having any ties to any political group or militia groups. The intelligence reports do claim that he's a part of the group. And there's also a testimony from his friend at the time that points to him being involved in a political group that is linked to the PFLP. And it's just like a far reach because, as we know, just because you're a member of the PFLP doesn't mean you go and blow up a synagogue, right? So Hassan denies ever being a part of any political group, and especially not a violent one.
I think it's also important we talk about intelligence reports like they're these solid, sealed, three-sourced things. I mean, you have to ask where the intelligence came from and how carefully it was collected. I always feel like that's this sort of crazy thing just to assume that an intelligence report means that it's true. And it's just not. It's proven over and over and over again that those reports had to be questioned. So I think that's really important too.
And in this case in particular, I mean, even Mark Treverdick, the investigating judge, didn't know how the intelligence was gathered, specifically what the sources of it were. Very little is known about that.
Always.
In this case.
Yeah. And that's one of Don Bain, Hassan's lawyer's big arguments when it came to the extradition hearings, is like basing, some information off of Stasi intelligence records, knowing that, of course, back then you could have gathered information through torture. You could, I don't know.
Neighbors squealed on each other to protect themselves. I mean,
exactly.
It's very obvious that's what happened. Yeah.
It's unknown sources, unknown circumstances. Who said what, when? Is this a human source? Is this just something some analyst made up? We have no idea.
Do they have an idea? Do the French courts have an idea? Or
No,
is it just...
no. The first record of the case conceded they did not know where this intelligence came from.
Dana, you actually meet Hassan in Ottawa at his home. When he's being investigated, it's 2008. Sort of where is Hassan in his life at this point?
Yeah. At this point, Hassan had gotten a PhD from New York, had moved to Ottawa, and was at the time teaching a course at the University of Ottawa, and then also later Carleton University. And he's a professor of sociology. And Hassan is also a father. He, at the time, had 3 children. He later has a 4th. I mean, the son was born while he was in prison in France. But yeah, at the time, a sociology professor, living a pretty quiet life in Ottawa, and a father.
When does Hassan Diab first understand that he is a suspect in all of this?
He was wrapping up a class, actually, in one of his sociology classes. And towards the end of the class, there was a line of students coming to ask him questions. And at the end of that line, there was a reporter from France, a man called Jean Chichizola. And he had flown from Paris to ask Hassan, the French want you for this in connection with this synagogue attack. What do you have to say? And in Hassan's version of events, this is the first time he had heard of the attack on Rue Copernic. And this is his first time that he had heard that he was a suspect in the case.
And had the investigative judge in France already started investigating him seriously before he even knew that he was a suspect?
I mean, this was like the best part of a year after Treverdick had.
Wow.
It was before he'd submitted his extradition request, obviously, but it was well into his investigation.
And the French start knocking on Canada's door, asking him to be extradited. So we have an extradition treaty between the two countries, which means that it's a process in which we are open to having a conversation about sending him back to France. But it's not as easy as just like the request. What goes into extraditing a Canadian citizen to a country like France?
There is an extradition treaty between Canada and France, but although when France requests a Canadian citizen, Canada usually obliges, but the reverse is not true. So if Canada wants a French citizen, and there was a case of a French priest that was accused, or maybe even charged, I don't know, but accused of sexual abuse against Native children, Canada had asked France to extradite him to Canada, and France refused. France does not extradite its citizens to Canada, but Canada extradites its citizens to France, which I think is quite interesting and something that comes up a lot in conversations around extradition law in Canada.
I mean, so in this case, as Dana said, Mark Treverdick spent about a year building up his case. And then when he felt he had enough, he went to the Canadian authorities and put in a request, which basically means that the Canadians take, they'll look at it and go through a process of hearings. And if they decide, not if they decide the person is guilty, but if they decide that the evidence presented by the French meets the threshold, that, it could plausibly lead to a guilty conviction if he was extradited, then they'll sign off the extradition. And then that's what happened with Hassan Diab. I mean, it was a multi-year hearing process, and there were lots of twists and turns within that, but eventually the extradition was signed off.
The extradition was signed off, but it sounds as though a lot of people, including the judge here in Canada, didn't feel comfortable with that signing, correct?
I think something that's like that I found pretty astonishing about this was that the judge charged with coming to a decision on whether or not Hassan Diab should be extradited, so the person basically in charge of signing off on the extradition, in his decision, he wrote that the French case was a weak case, replete with seemingly disconnected information. And when you read the whole report, it's pretty clear that he doesn't think that the French have a good case here. And Canada's extradition law is such that they had met a very low bar still, and he was still obliged to sign off on it.
I just want to also add that it is unusual to have such a long extradition hearing in Canada. Usually Canada quickly obliges. But in the case of Hassan Diab, his extradition hearings ended up being one of the longest in Canadian history. It's quite unusual.
Do we know why?
I think it's because the stakes were really high. I also think Hassan had an excellent lawyer.
Right.
Don Bain, who is one of the best criminal lawyers in Canada. And I think Don Bain took on the case. He took it on pro bono, and he is a fierce lawyer. Yeah, another reason actually why the extradition hearings took so long was because the evidence presented by the French was so weak, and the record of the case that they presented to the Canadians was disjointed, changed sometimes, and as the judge ended up saying later, was weak.
So the judge in Canada signs off. What happens? How do they get Hassan Diab to France?
So the judge in Canada signs off on the extradition after 6 years of extradition hearings. And the next day, Hassan is taken on a plane, does not get the chance to say goodbye to his wife, his pregnant wife at the time, and child. And he's taken on a flight to France. He arrives into Paris and is taken to a prison that is quite renowned in Europe. It's Europe's largest detention facility. It's called Fleury-Mérogis. It's kind of known to be where many high-profile bombers are taken across Europe. So he ends up, spending the next 3 years in a French prison.
What's he charged with?
He's not charged. And that's the most interesting part of all, isn't it? Because he ends up kind of languishing in this prison. There is no charges are presented. There was no trial. And Mark Trevidick says, well, I brought Hassan Diab over to investigate for further investigation. But Hassan never faces any trial in France, and he ends up languishing for 3 years. Hassan Diab does not speak to Mark Trevidick, and a year into his detention, Mark Trevidick is, his time as investigative judge in the anti-terrorism unit ends, and 2 new judges take his place. And as we know, those 2 judges end up, after 2 years of investigating, determining that there is insufficient evidence to keep Hassan in prison, and they send him back to Canada.
I just want to spend a bit more time in those 3 years, because I was working at a current affairs program on CBC called The Current at the time. And I remember that was when Canadians really started to sort of question what was going on. His wife was really active in trying to get his story out there. And that's where I first heard his name and what had happened. And it really seemed as though Canadians were sort of shaking their head. And it was a volatile time because it, like you said, it was still, the war on terror was still happening. We were still very much in that whole horrible sort of morass of all of that. So there was an unease about how to manage even thinking about this story. It was a complicated story, but it was starting to really pick up steam here, and there was a lot of support for him here to sort of end this, what seemed like, detention without any cause. And it really was shocking that there were no charges.
Yeah, I think it is shocking. It's something that, Amnesty International in Ottawa picked up, and a bunch of civil rights groups and human rights advocates really pushed for, even when Hassan was in detention in France.
And we are here today to say that in the case of Hassan Diab, we will not allow the rubber stamping of this extradition because this extradition is unjust.
I mean, when I walked through the halls of Carleton University, I saw posters of lectures taking place supporting Hassan Diab, asking for his, for students to come learn more about the case, even while he was in prison. I mean, there was a massive movement in Ottawa and across Canada to, quote, bring Hassan home, because it was quite shocking that for 3 years, no charges were presented. There was no trial that happened. And again, extradition law in Canada, I mean, we're not the first to say it, but probably needs some sort of reform. Like, it's quite something that also the reverse is not true, right? That if Canada wanted a French citizen, that they wouldn't oblige, and they have not obliged. So I think it was a time really difficult for Hassan, of course, in this maximum security prison, but also a time when his supporters really mobilized. And were successful in bringing Hassan's case to the spotlight, as we saw upon his return as well.
What was life like for him during those 3 years? What do you guys know about what it was like?
I mean, from what he told us, it sounds grim. Like he talks about being only allowed outside for, I think, around 2 hours a day. And he would spend that time just kind of pacing and or running around the courtyard as much as he could just to get exercise in. I think he became deeply paranoid during that time as well. I mean, he talks about how he at some point stopped eating the prison food, and he was living off of yogurt, and he said he would pick dandelions from the prison grounds and eat those. Like he just became deeply distrustful of the entire French system and everybody around him, to the point that he just stopped engaging.
You are in a constant state of hallucination, if I may say. You can't close your eyes. You sleep while your eyes are open, half open, and you start hallucinating. No, this is a different person. Or, you just see monsters, and the world is like not what you know.
And I mean, prison guards would say to him, like, why don't you look at me when you talk to me? And he would just think to himself, you don't exist. I don't see you. So I think mentally, the way he tells the story, that was the most, the most challenging period of his life, or the most challenging period in the story. And I think it took a toll on him. And I think, and I'm not sure that he's fully recovered still.
I suspect, I don't know if one can. Dana, how does it all end for him? You've obviously, we've mentioned he got himself back to Canada, but how does that happen?
So as I said, after Mark Trevidick finished his term as investigative judge, these two new judges took over the case and, investigated for 2 years, and in the end determined that there was insufficient evidence, and they dismissed the case. And Hassan flies back from France back to Canada upon his arrival in Ottawa airport. There's a welcome party for him, all his supporters, the support group, his lawyer, his wife, his children, meeting him at the airport. And we have footage of that scene, and it's quite emotional. Hassan comes back to a country that kind of celebrates his return. He is in the headlines. Eventually, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says what happened to Hassan Diab should never happen again. But very quickly, Hassan and his legal team realized that this is not the end, and that the French were going to appeal. So all along, Hassan knew that there was an appeal that would happen. And as we know, in 2023, the appeal is successful. A trial takes place with Hassan in absentia. He is tried in absentia and found guilty. And that was in April 2023, I believe. And here we are.
Obviously, he can't go back to France. I mean, on the books, he's a convicted person.
Yes, he is convicted of murdering 4 people and a bunch of other charges, but of murdering 4 people in association with a terrorist group.
And sentenced to life in prison.
And sentenced to life in prison.
And using the evidence that the judge in Canada argued wasn't worthy of an extradition.
Yeah, I mean, there's no new evidence in the case. In April 2023, when they tried him in absentia, it was raking over the same evidence that that the judge in Canada had seen, that the investigative judges had gathered over the years. But, there was no smoking gun. But one of the kind of astonishing things about the 2023 trial is the handwriting evidence, which I mentioned that hotel card earlier on.
Those 5 words you mentioned, Alex, and they match it. Those 5 words, they match to some of Hassan Diab's own handwriting, but it's sort of proven to be, pretty faulty, right? Yeah, I mean, so you had some French experts who decided that Hassan Diab's handwriting was a match for the hotel card, but you also, there were 4 or 5 American, British, and Canadian experts who basically said that the handwriting analysis conducted by the French was garbage, right? So that was, but even still, I mean, that's what the extraditing judge in Canada believed was among the most compelling evidence. In 2023, that handwriting evidence was thrown out. They didn't even use it in the April 2023 trial. They deemed it to be unreliable. So it's this kind of like flip-flopping of evidence and kind of using evidence at certain times and then deeming it to be unreliable at certain other times, and it gets pretty confusing pretty quickly, and yeah, it's actually wild. What are the chances he could be sent back? Like, is there any chance that the government will say, sure, send him back?
There's a high chance he could be sent back.
Really? Yes. Tell me more about that.
We're unclear if France has formally submitted an another extradition request for Hassan Diab. We believe they have, but of course it's up to Canada's Justice Minister to decide to extradite him or not, and they refuse to acknowledge whether they've received the extradition request or not. So that's the current status. The reality is that at any minute, the Justice Minister of Canada can decide that, yes, they do want to extradite Hassan Diab, and he could be arrested any minute, right now. He could be arrested like as we're speaking. The other part of this is that, and although in this government that is more liberal, I feel like that, and especially after Justin Trudeau's comments, I feel like that might be unlikely. However, Pierre Poilievre is likely to take over as Prime Minister in the upcoming election. Pierre Poilievre has posted comments about Hassan Diab, quotes, why is a convicted terrorist, kind of teaching in Canada's universities, and so has expressed that he would probably want to see Hassan Diab back in France. And so if he takes over as Prime Minister, the chances of Hassan being extradited again are quite high, just based on Pierre Poilievre's public statements around the case.
How is he doing with this thing hanging over his head?
Not good. Not good. I mean, it's not just Pierre Poilievre's tweets, because, Elon Musk retweeted those tweets and got over, the last time I checked, 21 million views on those tweets. And in the aftermath, Hassan has received death threats against him and his family. I think he sees this as yet another chapter of this case that I feel like he feels will never end. But no, it is not a good time for Hassan Diab. Yeah, I mean, the case has kind of taken on it's gotten another wind in the media, especially in the right-wing media. And there was there's a sort of concerted campaign to have Hassan Diab fired from his job at Carleton University. And it sort of escalated to the point where a right-wing media outlet hired a van with a billboard on it that sort of said something along the lines of like, why is a convicted terrorist teaching at Carleton University? Parked it outside the Carleton University campus and sort of spent the day vox popping students and, I mean, sort of just generally agitating.
This is Rebel News?
Yeah, I didn't want to say the name just because I don't want to give them any more publicity than they deserve. But yeah,
they also deserve to be accountable for their actions. Yeah,
this is Rebel News, and the story's been written up in a sort of pretty glib and unfavorable way in right-wing media here in the UK. The Daily Mail have written it up, and I don't know enough about Canadian media to say whether or not the National Post is right-wing, but they've sort of written quite a bit on it as well. Anyway, so I mean, suffice to say, like, that's led to a lot more attention on the case. For a lot of people, this is the first time they've heard the name Hassan Diab, and you know, seeing just the headline, convicted terrorist teaching at Carleton University, has outraged a lot of people.
With all the work that you've done on this and looking into it, where do you feel the responsibility lies for the bombing? Do you have any idea who actually did it?
I think for me, it's not so much about who did it, but more so about whether there's enough evidence to say that Hassan Diab is guilty. And I believe, no, there is not enough evidence to say that Hassan Diab is guilty.
Alex, do you think he's guilty? And if he's not, who might be?
I would say what I think sort of is irrelevant. We've spoken to dozens of people about this by now. We've gone through hundreds of pages of court documents and intelligence records, etc., and the evidence used to convict him is weak at best. The kind of thought I've had throughout this is like, if somebody I knew, if a family member or something like that was convicted of something like this on this evidence, I would be devastated. Like it truly sort of beggars belief in some instances, how weak some of the evidence is. As to who did it, I mean, the prevailing theory at the time was that it was the work of the far right. Some people believed that potential line of investigation wasn't investigated properly. There's issues of police involvement in far right groups at the time that could have potentially stymied an investigation like that. Another theory is that there was a group called Abu Nidal, who were a sort of much more rogue and much more extreme group based in Lebanon at the time. Mm-hmm. Some people have suggested that they might have been behind the attack. I mean, they were responsible for other attacks in Paris that were violent and that were targeted at Jewish businesses. There was a deli that was targeted by Abu Nidal around the same time. And so that is again, there has been nowhere close to enough investigation done into that potential line of investigation, but that's another sort of potential culprit that has been raised over the years.
Dana, why does it matter to you to tell this story?
I think it's important to tell this story because Hassan Diab's case is often diluted to, especially recently, to tweets and headlines from all sorts of media agencies, including far-right ones. And I think it's important because this is a case where you really have to dig into the details, and it reminds you about the importance of nuance, historical nuance, judicial nuance, legal nuance. And it's like a case that's caught between faulty legal systems. I mean, no justice system is perfect, but in the case of, Canada's extradition law, I think it's important because this story in particular is one where nuance is everything. And it's important to know the details of this case that's often just diluted into these wild headlines, especially recently.
Okay, guys, thank you. What great work. Your journalism shines. And it was really nice storytelling too. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. Thank you for having us.
You've been listening to Crime Story from CBC Podcasts. We release a new episode every Monday, so please remember to follow the show in your podcast app. You can get our next episode a week early on CBC Podcasts' YouTube channel or by subscribing to CBC Podcasts' True Crime channel on Apple Podcasts. In addition to early access, subscribers to our true crime channel also listen ad-free. Crime Story is hosted by me, Kathleen Goldhar. Our producers are Nikki Manfredi and Mitchell Stewart. Sound design by Julian Uzielli and Mitchell Stewart. Audio sourced from INA Société, Canada Land's podcast The Copernic Affair, and The Ottawa Citizen. Our senior producer is Jeff Turner, our video producer is Evan Agard, and our YouTube producer is John Lee. Executive producers are Cecil Fernandez and Chris Oak. Tanya Springer is the senior manager of CBC Podcasts, and Arif Noorani is the director of CBC Podcasts.